In case you haven't been told, Africa is fucking huge. By now, many of you should have already ran across one of these true size of Africa maps. If not, you may quite possibly have been living under a rock somewhere. Fix that. Anyhow, just look how all of that can fit in there with room to spare. Amazing. This awesome fact, however, has often been propagandized and weaponized in order to dispel any ideas of African unity before or after colonialism. This is something to be aware of. Let's take this map showing an approximation of the size of African kingdoms. It's great, but it doesn't tell us how Africa is a richly interwoven tapestry of interconnected cultures, traditions, and people. Perhaps none had been able to demonstrate this most salient fact as plainly as the African scientist, historian, linguist, and political visionary, Cheikh Anta Diop. At times criticized for a perceived overemphasis on Kemet, ancient Egypt. But is this really so? You yourself may be one of those who say, well, West Africans are a beautiful people with an incredible history. Why would they need to attach themselves to ancient Egypt? And although the question is heavily skewed, I would say you are right. West Africans do not need to attach themselves to anything, but the truth still remains the truth and should always be acknowledged as such. Furthermore, Western Africans have nothing to envy from anyone at all. The scientific data is replete with ancient pre-Islamic sites where we charted the pathways of the stars and commemorated the deceased. Western Africans have long displayed their legendary traditions of city planning, wealth distribution, and human ingenuity as evidenced by our forms of architecture in mud brick or stone buildings, pot-shirred pavements, and areas of collective worship in the name of the divine. Yet how are all of these things really supposed to disconnect us from ancient Egypt? Let's listen to an expert and hear what it is he has to say.
Look at the lips of the Negroes like that and the nose like this. It's not really the Egyptian origin at all. No, they were dark skinned,
but they were not black.
But they're not Negro. And this is why you cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different.
You heard the man. Apparently, a difference in phenotype strictly forbids any connection between these two very African populations. What nonsense. Perhaps people of African descent are merely just legally blind. These faces couldn't actually be familiar faces that the ancients left of themselves, which look like your neighbor, your distant relatives, or perhaps maybe even your children. No. According to people like Zahi Hawass, they are a figment of your Negro imagination.
Look at the lips of the Negroes like that and the nose like this. Look at the lips of the Negroes like that and the nose like this. The lips of the Negroes like that and the nose like this.
Well, maybe we could lend this stance credence if it were only the faces that were familiar. These familiarities span across all sorts of cultural expressions and techniques. They are striking resemblances in artistic expressions, in our musical instruments, and even in our deepest and most sacred religious beliefs. So, what do we make of all this? Surely we cannot simply blame Cheikh Anta Diop for these inferences. From the beginning, classical European authors, as well as the Arab historians after them, all linked ancient Egypt with Black Africa. early Egyptology was no different. If I were to sum up the works of James Henry Breasted in one line, I may say,
the Egyptians just looked like they were black, but they were of the great white race.
Author C.G. Seligman, who essentially coined the racist Hamitic theory, perceived the undeniable imprint of ancient Egypt nearly everywhere in Africa. He even traced roots to better explain the impact Egypt would have on Black Africa in regions such as the Blue Nile and Ethiopia, the Great African Lakes region of the Congo, as well as the Senegal and the Niger rivers. Seligman's Egyptians, however, were Caucasoid men who were superior to all others in Africa due to their inherent proximity to whiteness. This fictitious, faulty, racist, and diffusionist theory, however, had real effects. It was used to justify the colonial subjugation of indigenous peoples, especially in Africa, but around the world. And ultimately, it helped fuel the flames of the infamous Rwanda genocide in 1994, 2 decades after the Cairo Symposium, where Cheikh Anta Diop had demonstrated the pseudo-scientific nature of the still lingering Hamitic theory and the true relationship between classical Egypt and modern Black Africa. Under this light, we can see how important these recurring questions truly are. Since then, the field of anthropology has attempted to steer clear away from the question of Egypt in Africa, chastising perceived Afrocentrics while supporting nonsense, such as we can hear with some.
And this is why you cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different. Or from Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, it's different, completely.
The field of Egyptology, anthropology, Western media and its education systems have tended to have been much more comfortable with these kinds of representations of the ancient Egyptians, where the darker-skinned humans are permanently relegated to a servile class and somewhere in the background, most preferably. These artificially sustained pseudoisms have led many to question the basic geography of the planet and to wonder whether Egypt is even actually on the African continent, and this at a PhD level. Yet, if modern dissenters say ancient Kemet was isolated and disconnected from the rest of the continent, what is it that the ancient Egyptians have to say for themselves in their own writings? If we take the document known as the Famine Stela, for instance, it describes the great pharaoh Djoser-Netcheket dispatching the renowned vizier Imhotep to the very south of Egypt at Elephantine, the celestial lands facing Wawat, in order to find the birthplace of Hapi, the Netcher of the Nile River. The pharaoh describes this region as the place through which the ancestors had made their way and which no kings have equaled ever since. This passage clearly demonstrates the deference which kings gave to the deep ancestral south, in and beyond the region of Tarseti. Let us speak of Harkuf and his expeditions to the land of Yam. The land of Yam has yet to be located and confirmed, but scholars seem to place its location being somewhere south of Khartoum, nearing the Central African Republic and South Sudan. Harkuf went on 4 expeditions to the land of Yam. On one of these expeditions, Harkuf is described as bringing back pygmies to the royal court, as only they could perform certain holy dances for praising the Netcheru. This contact between pygmies and ancient Egyptians is crystallized in the veneration of the god Bez, and the narrative of the expedition is in line with the literature from other African peoples who have encountered the pygmies in Africa. And what of the great Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty and her famous expedition to Punt? There are over 20 of these expeditions recorded in Egyptian texts through the Pharaonic era. The land of Punt is believed to be situated between the Eritrean and Swahili coasts and likely represents a shifting region over time. The Egyptians depicted the Africans of Punt and their environment, as well as the trade items which they exchanged with these people. This makes the Egyptian accounts of their expeditions to Punt extremely valuable in the study of African history and the evolution of its societies. Lastly, we must speak of the Egyptian expeditions into Western Africa as evidenced by the Jebel Uweinat inscriptions left under the command of Pharaoh Mentuhotep II, who dispatched this expedition into Chad. These inscriptions illustrate the local rulers of Tekabet and Yam in the Uweinat region, bringing tribute to the pharaoh in his passing. Modern scholars have associated this expedition with trade and this route with a religious mission to ancient Lake Chad, most likely the physical representation of the Nun waters in the Amduat on Earth. This history, written down in Egyptian records, attests to the interconnectivity of Africans, their social relations, and likely some of their shared religious beliefs with other African peoples. This is far from representing all of the Egyptian accounts of travel throughout Africa and their relationships with the people whom they found there and often maintained relations with over a period of 3,000 years. Various African groups also certainly traveled into Egypt and the Greater Pharaonic region. There are many more examples to show. So what now becomes of this impossibility of connecting the pharaonic civilizations of Northeast Africa to those of other African regions, namely south of Egypt? Obviously, Cheikh Anta Diop was pertinently correct in examining the connections which exist between these two African axes of history. Previously on this channel, we went over some of the striking linguistic evidence initially brought out by Cheikh Anta Diop. We looked at his comparisons between Wolof, Medu Necher, and the Coptic language. The results are incredible. We also went over some modern commentary, even some phrasal correspondences, as well as triliteral word glosses. Now that we've heard what the ancient Egyptians have to say, the question is, what is it that West Africans themselves say on this matter? Fortunately, the Western African Sahel had developed a highly sophisticated institution of trained oral historians known colloquially as griots. Some of these histories were written down from oral accounts during the Islamic era, and eventually copies made it into the hands of some of the early European colonizers of Western Africa and were translated into their languages. One of the earliest accounts of this kind in the Senegambia is that of Yoro Bolidiao, a son of royal lineage. In his account, he details 6 migrations out of Egypt over the span of nearly 1,000 years, which populated much of the region. This text has been examined by scholars such as Abu Bakri Musalam, who brings attention to the veracity of its claims via historical and linguistic evidences. Indeed, words are not simply just words. A single term can open us up to a whole new universe of information. Let us simply take this triliteral cognate list. If we but consider the single shared term here for horse, it raises many questions. When does the domesticated horse even show up in the Senegambia? Why would West African languages, namely the Jollof language, share so many words for horse with Egyptian and Coptic at the exclusion of, say, Arabic, Berber, or Hebrew? Actually, West African griot traditions associate the horse not with the Arab Muslim, nor with the Moor, but with the Soninka. Yoro Diao describes the migrants from Kemet riding stallions into the region. And not only does the language of the Jollof share so many words for horses and equestrian culture with Egyptian, but the very name the Wolof have for the Soninka seems to be related to the Egyptian word for horse and horseman. The Soninka's oldest clan, the Sise, also reflect this root, whereas the Sise cluster in Semitic languages is deemed by linguists to be an Egyptian dialecticism. If Sise were a Semitic borrowing into West African languages, it still does not account for the many other terms for horse and equestrian realia available, which leaves an Egyptian source as a closest match. This is a very complicated matter, but we seem to be able to make sense of it. In order to more fully appreciate this segment of history, we must make a journey to the last imperial stronghold of the Soninka, the Great Ouagadougou, or as it is colloquially known, the Ghana Empire. The Ghana Empire was located in the cliffs of modern Mauritania, and today it is commonly represented by the more recent stone ruins of Dar Tichit, Olata, and other environing sites. At its height, the Ghana Empire controlled much of the Saharan trade in the region. The Tichit tradition represents the oldest examples of social stratification in West Africa at as early as 4000 BC. These constructions are associated with the Proto-Mande peoples after their migration southwest from the central Sahara. In these settlements, we can observe remnants of farming activities, metallurgy, numerous funerary tombs, pottery, and a rock art tradition. We also note the use of stone-walled compounds, circumvallation walls, as well as erected turriform gardens and the layout of streets, walled dams for water management, and the depictions of pack animals and chariots. This does seem to prelude the later sophistication of the Ghana Empire in medieval records, except that there is a considerable gap between the Tichit tradition and imperial Ghana. At around 500 BC, the Tichit tradition seems to die out for a time. This is consistent with the arrival of Libyco-Berbers thought to be the Garamante. Western scholars believe that the push southward of the desert and the arrival Libyco-Berbers is what caused the sudden change. This brings us back to our discussion about the horse. Scholars have varied in scientific opinion over the years. Moni placed the horse period from 1200 BC to present. Yet this early date has been brought into question. Mussolini holds no later than 700 BC in Mauritania. Vernet and Naffer place the images of chariots and some horses between 500 and 0 BC, while MacDonald remains conservative. The period of 500 to 0 BC is, however, particularly intriguing, as that is the time of the arrival of the Libyco-Berbers. Rock art panels in the Guilemsi region of Mauritania suggest a violent confrontation between the so-called Libyco-Berbers and the Tichit inhabitants. Going back to the oral traditions, they do also mention a violent but brief confrontation between the migrants from Kemet and the local populations, which did, however, end in an alliance. These autochthones were known as the Kokoro in the Soninka traditions. Could these Libyco-Berbers represent the Kemetic migrants of our oral traditions? The Libyco-Berbers in question are most likely the legendary Garamantes, as we find bi-triangular horse illustrations in Mauritania, which are highly associated with the Garamante. The same style can be found 3,500 miles away, back in Chad and the Central Saharan region. This demonstrates the incredible geographic range of the Garamantes. Although the latter have been associated with slave raids, in order to man their constructions in the Sahara, the utter defeat of armed enemies in the panels at Guilemsi seems to hint at something a little different. By now, you might be wondering, who are these mysterious Garamante? The Garamantes were located in the central Sahara, bordering the northern coastal regions of Carthage, Numidia, and Egypt, and the southern borders of the Sahel. They emerged around 900 BC, experienced massive growth around 500, and dominated the Saharan trade until around the 400s AD. They are described by all accounts as being of mixed Mediterranean, Berber, and Negro heritage. Yet, all of the physical descriptions of the Garamantes seem to describe them as quite dark, if not black. The Garamantes managed to build an awe-striking civilization in the middle of the Saharan desert, and the ruins of their capital city still exist today and are being excavated by specialists. They are especially known for being a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire, as well as for the raiding of Ethiopian troglodytes on horse-driven chariots, as they have been described in classical sources. Scholars today question the true validity of this statement. The Garamantes of the Libyan Fezzan were commonly believed to be the ancestors of the Tuareg, who occupy similar zones of the Sahara and the Sahel, ever since it was suggested by authors in antiquity. Biological evidence, however, based on classical genetic markers from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, produce results which indicate kinship with the Beja of eastern Sudan, along with an expansion into the region at about 1000 BC. The Beja are believed to be associated with the Blemis of antiquity, and thus an offshoot of the Magi soldier class, who often policed the ancient Egyptian civilization, and at certain times the Beja and other pharaonic groups, such as the Kushites or Nubians, were in control, if not of the throne, then of considerably important parts of Egypt, namely in the south. The island of Elephantine, for instance, was a massive pilgrimage site under their control in different eras. What then become of the ramblings of a Zahi Hawass, when several diasporan Africans can trace their lineage to the Tuareg, who themselves are genetically connected to the Blemis or Beja people?
Skills.
Let's show it here.
Okay. Dated several centuries before Jesus Christ.
Yes.
It is an old prescript of Tuareg, and still it is used. And this is what makes the language surviving, actually.
I guess we can all go home now. But let us instead dig a little deeper. We still need to clarify who the Garamantes truly are. Two separate biological tests were run on Garamante remains that found similar results from different perspectives. Dr. Marta Mirazon Lach et al. Found Garamantes share closest physical affinities with Neolithic Sahelan samples from Chad, Mali, and Niger, and secondarily to Roman Egyptians from Alexandria and Nubians from Soleb. Dr. Eftimia Nikita et al. Also found the closest matches to be, of course, the Garamante themselves, but Giza, Kerma, and Soleb, and to a lesser extent, Algerians and Carthaginians. The Garamantes were a unique population with their closest consistent affinities to both populations from pharaonic Egypt on one hand, and those from the Niger River and Chad on the other. This is quite interesting, and we frankly still have not yet deviated from what is said in the West African oral literatures. The so-called Libico-Berbers may have very well been Yoro-Diao's migrants. But were they? How then did the ancient Egyptians perceive the Libico-Berbers, or Garamante? What were their relations during the pharaonic era? Ancient Egyptian depictions of Libyans were quite diverse. The Kemetu named several Libyan groups believed to be Libico-Berbers. These are the Meshwesh, the Chemehu, and the Rebu, and populations by other names have been noted in antiquity. One consistent element in the depiction of Libyans is the dual feather headdress, as we seem to find this style around the Sahara, and likely in instances of Libico-Berbers depicting themselves. This may have represented a certain group or lifestyle common to Libico-Berber populations. The numerous illustrations on Egyptian walls depict the diversity of these populations. There were a small number of rulers thought to be of Libyan origin, particularly in the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, such as Pharaoh Shoshenq and Ayuput, who was defeated by Piye. Strabo places Taharqa all the way on the other side of the Sahara in Old Mauritania at the entrance of southern Spain. This idea proliferated even into medieval times. And, at very least, accounts such as these point to the potential of immense movement on the borders and out of Egypt going west. It is also interesting to consider that according to Roger Blench, it is difficult to tie the Garamante language to modern Berber languages, but instead they may have spoken a Nilo-Saharan language. The script which they use comes out of the Phoenician script, which itself evolved out of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Use of this script is actually relatively common in the Sahel. Here is an example of an engraved tree in Niger. Ever inclined towards practical usages, the Libico-Berber script is often used to mark the ownership of cattle among pastoralists. In the Senegambia, they have even been attested as being used to communicate small messages between distant or secret parties. The Fulani and the Seria are known for using this system, especially in the marking of cattle. Clearly, the story of literacy in Africa is still yet to be told. What we can be certain about is that if the Garamantes were ever successful in mounting a mighty civilization in the middle of the Sahara Desert, it is with greatest thanks to one single element: water. Indeed, the Garamantes developed a highly advanced system of irrigating water out of the underground waterbeds of the Sahara. This technological advancement was first developed in Persia, but scientists weren't sure how this technology reached the Fezzan Desert. Some scholars had initially advanced that it might have came through southern Europe and into North Africa. Instead, as it turns out, it seems more likely that Fogaras got to Fezzan from Egypt, as recent excavations in Karga Oasis of the Western Desert have established a series of Fogaras there that date from the era of the Achaemenid domination over ancient Egypt, with its usage persisting into the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The Fogaras consisted of a series of wells connected to a huge underground water tunnel. During this period, trade routes are known to have stretched from the Niger Bend up through Fezzan to Egypt via the oasis of the Western Desert. This is the route scholars associate with the spread of this technology into the Sahara. This heavy influence from Egypt into the Fezzan is consistent with some of the material finds among the Garamante, including their pyramidal tombs and their forms of pottery. It is believed Garamantes prayed to the Libico-Egyptian god Ammon, and perhaps some other minor shared deities. This expansion from Egypt in the 5th century BC runs remarkably consistent with our oral traditions in the Senegambia, as well as the available archaeological data. But what else was going on during the era of Achaemenid Egypt? Although we can definitely note some technological advances at hand, as it often happens in the case of war. But war is still nothing more than that: bloody war. The conflicts between Mesopotamian states and the pharaonic civilizations of the Nile region could easily be characterized as the First World Wars. This dynamic is best exemplified by the power struggle between Pharaoh Taharqa of the 25th dynasty and Esarhaddon the Great Conqueror out of Assyria. Here is an excerpt from a narration of one of his campaigns.
I counted as treasures of his palace the gods and goddesses of Taharqa, king of Kush. Together with their possessions I took his wife, his court ladies, Ushaluhuru, his crown prince, courtiers, his personal attendants.
Perhaps no document better exemplifies the Achaemenid destruction of Egypt than the sack of Thebes. We can observe archers raining down offensive fire upon their Egyptian and Kushite enemies. Fighting men fall from the top of watchtowers as other men charge up ladders to attack them. Walls are being brought down as severed heads are paraded over vanquished captives being marched away. All manner of men, women, and their beasts are taken prisoner. The destruction in the sack of Thebes, arguably the holiest city of all Egypt, is brutal, total, and indelible. It may not have been as terrible if it had stopped there. Further aggression towards Kemet was then led by the infamous Cambyses of classical records. Cambyses continued the feud against the Egyptians with particular fervor. He too added to the tradition of his predecessors and siphoned countless essential personnel and precious materials out of Egypt and into Persia. The classical authors accuse Cambyses of all sorts of crimes. He is depicted as a madman filled with hatred of the Egyptian gods, his most egregious act being the killing of the Apis bull. Even Darius, who is touted as being the mildest out of all the Achaemenid conquerors of Kemet, also bragged about the Egyptian artists he acquired. In a text describing the construction of his palace at Susa, Darius is quoted, "The goldsmiths who wrought the gold, those were Medes and Egyptians. The men who wrought the wood, those were Sardinians and Egyptians. The men who adorned the walls, those were Medes and Egyptians." We can see that there is some semblance of getting a kick out of all this, and a degree of prestige out of the fact of having subjugated many peoples, but especially those great Nile River inhabitants. This siphoning of essential personnel out of ancient Egypt into Persia nearly lasted 200 years altogether, and was extensive enough that it created a brain drain in Egypt that became painfully apparent in the quality of its arts and its sciences from that point forward, never to truly recover its old indigenous splendor. This episode was never forgotten by Egyptians and remained a stain on their conscience, and it is even preserved in West African oral traditions. The affronts toward the indigenous Nile River Egyptians, however, did not stop there either. Herodotus tells us that during the 26th dynasty, Egyptian soldiers, numbered at around 240,000, all abandoned their posts after having not been relieved in over 3 years, in a context where the throne was perceived to be favoring foreign states and foreign mercenary groups. This might have been a huge affront, considering that previously the Egyptian armed forces may have been consistent of state-sanctioned generational hereditary positions. Herodotus tells us that these lot all migrate to Ethiopia behind this betrayal, abandoning their city gods and their wives, where they are given land in exchange for their services for the king of Meroe, despite the pleas of the clearly compromised pharaoh of the time. If we can retain anything from this account, it is once again the suggestion of a massive movement of Egyptians out of Egypt and into the south, and this at the displeasure of a newly installed puppet government. From this point on, several accounts of pharaohs, rebel kings, and even deities are recorded fleeing south, away from the northern aggressions. Battles ensued over the ownership of Upper Egypt and key regions of trade and worship. It is around this time that Nubia and the lands south of Egypt under Meroe, Kush, and the Blemmyes assume the only authentic pharaonic monarchies on the continent, as Egypt became further subjugated and absorbed into the Greek and Roman worlds. And thus the final light had shone over ancestral Kemet, Tameri, the beloved land. So far, we've provided textual academic evidence backing the general notion held within West African oral traditions concerning a reason for departure and an actual evacuation. Is there academic evidence that suggests movement into Western Africa? We have mentioned the expedition to Chad, but let us talk a bit more about the Fogara tradition, which spread from the Egyptian Western Desert to Garamante territory in the Fezzan at around 500 BC. Yet let us first note that Karga and Ain Manawir are close to the region of Aswan, which is important because it was the most hotly contested economic and religious zone between the southern pharaonic contingency and Greco-Roman Egypt. It sat on the Nile as a center of mass pilgrimages to the holy temples at Elephantine. The statue of Isis at Elephantine was ritually paraded in a procession that reached as far south as Khartoum before coming back up to her seat at the temple. The Soninka people of West Africa, associated with the Tichit tradition, say that they come from Aswan, so much so that the Berbesh Berbers of Mauritania refer to them as Aswanic, those of Aswan. Aswan, however, is the Arabic approximation of ancient Egyptian SWNW, which eventually became Coptic Swan. The Soninka call this place Sona, the men or the children of Sona. They also name other locations that mark their place of origin, such as Korotu, of the legendary Korotumu River. Scholars such as Abu Bakri Musalam have associated this term with the Kereti of Egyptian legend, the twin caverns from which sprang forth the Nile inundation in southern Egypt. Divine characters appearing in the Soninka myths, hailing them from their original homeland, are strikingly Kemetic, including vultures, jackals, owls, and cobras, though we would need a separate video to go over those details. Long story short, the Soninka attach themselves to Aswan, and their arguments seem to be quite solid. Again, before leaving Egypt, we depart from Aswan and Kharga in the south and look towards the northwest, the legendary Siwa region. Siwa, much like the ancient desert city Garama, was a city in the desert and only able to sustain itself thanks to the water from its oases and from its springs and wells. The Siwa oasis was also a region somewhat unto its own, yet under Egyptian influence. It had always been a Libyan stronghold, and it is said to only have become seriously occupied by Egyptians in the 20th and 26th dynasties, perhaps consistent with Kushite expansions in the region. The Oracle of Amun at Siwa is where Alexander the Great allegedly came to get a reading with the Egyptian priests of Ammon and to inquire whether he was truly the son of Zeus Ammon. The answers the priests gave seem to have never been documented, but Alexander went on to become king of Egypt after defeating the Persians. The myth of Alexander and the oracle of Amun is tied to a tale of the last Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo, in that it is Ammon who impregnated Alexander's mother through the person of Nectanebo, who is otherwise said to have fled south into Nubia. Perhaps several of these things could be true, but what is certain is that this narrative was used to solidify Alexandrian claims and that of the Ptolemaic rule which issued out of it. It thereby suggests the importance of the Siwa oracle in the late period. One of the most salient features of the Siwa oasis is the giant pool or well of Siwa. It seems to be unique in its size, reflecting the monumental construction habits of imperial Egypt. If we can agree that Siwa represents the farthest point west in domestic Egypt before fully entering the Sahara, it makes sense that this site would bear such a feature. Keep this in mind, as we will return to this idea in just a moment. We have shown how by 500 BC Foggara technology had spread from the Egyptian Western Desert into the Libyan Fezzan. And scholarship has demonstrated how from 1 AD to 500 of our era is when the Foggara technology spread further west into the regions of northern and southern Algeria, and by 1500 AD they had proliferated through Morocco. This can be argued to be in total phase with the West African oral traditions, especially as described by Dr. Musalam, since both the Soninka and the Jollof accounts mention a significant stay in the desert. In some accounts, it is a region called Tiit, which Lam has proposed may have been Tidikelt. This site is now known to be one of the main concentrations of Foggara after the Egyptian Western Desert and the Libyan Fezzan. This movement westward shows the likely migration of ideas, people and goods across the desert. Contrary to some archaic views, which perceived the Sahara as an impenetrable barrier, scholar J.D. Mattingly informs us that in a brilliant analysis of the famous Herodotian account of the Sahara, Liverani has pointed out that the 10-day interval that recurs through that section is in fact the canonical distance between major wells in all periods of Saharan trade. In other words, it represents the maximum distance that an animal-borne caravan can safely travel between major wells and oases. The logic is that places mentioned by Herodotus had specifically developed in the early 1st millennium BC as a trade route. I find this remarkably persuasive, and it ties in with current thinking about the introduction of the horse. It also demonstrates the role of Libyan communities in creating their own trade routes. It is a route from the western desert of Egypt, passing via the major central Sahara nexus of oases, and ultimately reaching the Niger. Herodotus indeed describes a chain of oases stretching from the Nile to the Atlantic. Ammon Siwa is 10 days from Ogula, and the next oasis beyond Ogula is in the land of the Garamantes. The Garamantes are situated at a 30-day distance from the coast. Most direct route is through the land of the Lotophages. West of the Garamantes, after 10 days, come the Atarantes. Then, after another 10 days, a mountain called Atlas and a people called the Atlantes. Then, after a further 10 days, a salt mine. This salt mine is thought to have been in either southern Morocco or Tichit. Between late BC times and the early medieval period, the water tables beneath the desert began to dry up and decline. Coupled with labor and maintenance issues, most foggers were abandoned, and a shift can be noted unto smaller-scale agriculture supported by well technology, which also spread west. This fact seems consistent with the ancient Greek myths about what are known as the wells of the sun. These wells of the sun all seem to be of monumental scale and attached to a varying but common mythology, which describes the wells as magical and the waters of the wells to be cool during the day and warm during the night. In the Egyptian variant of the Amduat, it is Lake Chad, as the reflection to the waters of Nun on earth, and which are protected by a giant serpent. We find similar mythology, not only as we have seen at Keriti, the twin caverns from where the Nile springs forth, but in distant West Africa surrounding a certain kind of ancient well, complete with mentions of Egypt, serpents, and a similar temporal dichotomy. We have now left Siwa and have made it to the furthest western edge of the desert. And what do we find but another monumental well? Except in our time, it has been completely dried up, unlike the one at Siwa, which has also served as tourist destination. It is said that this well in westernmost Africa was created thousands of years ago by 8 great ancient ancestors who were the descendants of a certain pharaoh. These people were giants, measuring 40 feet tall, and used giant tree trunks to dig out this mystical well. When these people knew that their time on earth was coming to an end, they filled up the wells with giant tree trunks and clay until all that was left was a bushy mound. No one knows how long the time was between the closing of the well and its reopening. A divine serpent who spent 12 months in the well and 12 months in the ocean is said to have led to its rediscovery. What stands out the most is that when the people finally reopened the well, one side of the well remained dry and the other side filled with water. This water was valued for its healing qualities, and the well itself became an oracle. Historically, similarly to Siwa, kings came to this location to solidify their kingship. Sacrifices of rams or bulls were also made at the mouth of the well to incur blessings over the entire region. The motif of 8 ancestral giant beings and the water recalls the imagery which illustrates the Nuun and ideas of foundation. While we know that the language and reference to 8 divine founding ancestors employed in the myth reflects ancient Egypt, the digging out of this giant well and its recovering by these same peoples who knew that their time was coming to an end is consistent with classical descriptions of the Garamantes and how they covered up the wells in their oases after using them in order to preserve authority and control over the Saharan trade routes. It is also consistent with scholars like Dr. Blear's description of pre-Islamic trade routes, which had partially been controlled by a Copt-like group before the Arabs, a likely precursor to the legendary Wangara and Zagara trade confederation of the Middle Ages, which spanned across the African Sahel. And to think that we got all the way here just with a few questions about the horse. We have attempted to undertake a journey back and forth across the Sahara and across eras within the lapse of a single hour. Tracking the horse has allowed us to lend credence to much of what is said in the West African oral traditions. Other common terms have the potential to be just as revealing. There is also recently published genetic evidence which seems to point to all that we have discussed in this video. The Fulani, for instance, have been shown to carry DNA which ties them to northern Africa, perhaps to Algeria, through admixture from the Iberian Peninsula. Consistent with the idea of proto-Senegambians in Tiet. They also carry southern European admixture, which was likely introduced through northeast Africa, consistent with the idea of contact with populations from late-period Egypt and Nubia. The Ghana Empire is also imagined to have attracted gene flow from northeast and northwest Africa. We can also note Old Sudanese or Nilotic gene flow present in Gambians dating to 0 CE. Pathological investigations into human remains in Egypt's Middle Kingdom identified a strain of tuberculosis, which has since disappeared from Africa and has been found to have proliferated into West Africa. This, including genetic links between the Beja and Tuareg, seem to point to significant movements of people from the general region of Northeast Africa into West Africa within the range of 1000 BC into the Common Era. Instead of a singular story of exclusive and prestigious origins, boasting one ethnic group's greatness over the other, West African oral traditions represent a history of interconnectivity between historical groups, interdependence, resilience, and adaptability. Clearly, African history is far from having revealed all of its secrets. We are just now scratching the surface as it concerns the nature of pre-colonial Africa and its multitudes of interconnected nodes. The sands of the Sahel and the Sahara, the griots, and the thousands of still largely untranslated medieval texts from West Africa still have much to reveal to us. Common origins and the truths in these oral traditions, which we have paralleled with modern scientific facts, help explain the many similarities we see in pharaonic Northeast Africa and all the way in the westernmost parts of the African Sahel. These narratives are also the story of civilization and the importance of natural resources such as water. The challenges of today also require us to have a solid understanding of the natural world. Our future, survival, and ability to thrive in this world will always depend on our ability to answer the challenges which nature will give us. I hope this video was helpful to you in some way or another on your journey of understanding African history. If you found value at all in this video, smash the like button and share it with a friend. Subscribe to see more videos like these and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Do you think we have shown a likely route from Egypt and Nubia to the West African Sahel? Or do you still agree with Zahi Hawass that it is impossible to connect the ancient Egyptian civilization to Africa south of Aswan? We value your opinion, so let us know. Until then, my friends.